Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S. Dear students, congratulations to all who have cleared the prelims 2020. Now, without any delay, you should start focusing on upcoming mains examination. We all know that right now the focus areas should be revision and answer writing practice in all the important themes of GS mains, with of course special emphasis on essay paper as well as GS4 ethics and integrity. Then the focus should be on attempting GS mains full length tests and revision and answer writing practice in optional subject. For the first two action points, RAU'S is inviting all its current as well as ex-students as well as our DNS followers who have cleared prelims 2020 to start with General Studies main test series and Quality Improvement Program for Mains 2020. Now the GS MTS and QIP 2020 as it's known, this program will help you first revise all important themes for upcoming Mains 2020. For this, there shall be Mains Compass, which will be subject-wise compilations, as well as Quality Improvement Program classes, which shall cover all the important topics of static as well as current affairs from the last 1 year. This program will do extensive answer writing practice in all important themes of GS paper 1, 2, 3, 4 as well as essay paper in QIP classes. Then this program will fine-tune your answer writing approach through rigorous testing, sample answers, evaluation and personal mentorship from the teachers. And so, the features of the QIP MTS program 2020 shall be answer writing and test discussion via live online classes of around 100 hours, thematic tests around 10, 12 full-length tests and 2 essay tests, sample answers within word limit shall be provided, evaluation shall be given within time limits, and personal mentorship shall also be provided for the mains tests. Now the fees for our MTS and QIP 2020 course is 30,000 rupees. But this course is complimentary for all the current students of our RAU'S, and the course is available at only 5,500 rupees for those who have cleared prelims 2020. Now this 5,500 fee is applicable to RAU'S ex-students as well as DNS followers who have cleared the prelims examination. Let us work to give mains 2020 your best shot. RAU'S Study Circle is with you as always. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. An answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 28th of October 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion. The first news which we have taken for discussion today appears as a lead article on page number 6. India's Discom stress is more than the sum of its past. This particular article discusses the main issues plaguing our distribution of electricity sector. It talks about what are the challenges faced by the distribution companies because of which they are perpetually in loss. But we will not keep ourselves limited to the issues and arguments raised in this particular editorial. But rather, we will discuss the challenges in generation, transmission as well as distribution sector. Then we'll talk about two important schemes which the government of India has initiated for the distribution sector, and then finally what more needs to be done in all the three sectors to reform the power sector. This is important because under GS3 syllabus, infrastructure, energy is an important part, and that is why once you cover the issues with all the three ingredients of power sector, that is generation, transmission and distribution, this topic is prepared for the mains examination. So we all know that efficient and reliable power infrastructure is one of the most important requisite for sustainable and inclusive economic growth in the country. And the significance of power sector can be realized from the fact that it is one of the indicators of the GDP growth as well. If the demand for power is increasing, that will be reflected in increasing rate of GDP growth. And so that is why power is one of the pillars for GDP. So let us first understand the three components of the power sector. We all know that in order to consume power, it first needs to be generated, and hence there is a generation sector, the power plants, atomic nuclear power plants, hydroelectric power plants, thermal power plants based on either gas or coal. And so once the power is generated, it needs to travel to the final consumer, and that is known as transmission. The mega power lines which you see when you drive along a highway, that is called transmission. When electricity starts from a generator, it reaches to the nearest distribution house, from where it is ultimately transferred to the final consumer, either a home or an industrial complex or whatever it may be. And in order to understand the overall issues with the power sector, we have to understand the issues with each of these stages of power consumption. And we will start by understanding the issues with the generation sector first. Now, the first and foremost challenge faced by the power sector as far as generation of power is concerned, that deals with the availability of fuel. Now you have to understand that the majority of power is right now being produced by burning of coal. And especially after the cancellation of licenses that was in coal scam, there was a severe scarcity of coal availability in our country. And because of which, the companies which were based on coal started to import the coal, and the prices of imported coal was very high, which led to the increasing cost of power production. And hence you can say that fuel security is the most critical bottleneck for the industry, as it accounts for nearly 3/4 of the total cost of generation. And that is why the generation sector is so important. Then the next issue is the low plant load factor of a unit. Now, plant load factor is a percentage of energy sent out by power plant corresponding to the installed capacity. For example, if a particular power plant has the capacity to produce 600 megawatt of electricity, but it is being run at half the capacity, which means that it is only producing around 300 megawatt. And so, most of the power plants are running at lower capacity than what they can produce. This leads to revenue loss. Now you will ask, then why, if we can produce more power, we are producing less power instead? And that is because of the delays in payments from the distribution companies. Just in the introduction, we have understood that the distribution companies in India are extremely loss-making ventures. Since they are loss-making, they are debt-ridden, and hence they are not able to pay back for their earlier bills which were owed to the generators. Since they don't get earlier bills, they do not produce as much power as it is required. So these are the issues because of which the capacity addition or the addition of newer generating units into India's power sector becomes difficult, because if an industrialist or a businessman wants to open a generator or a power plant, then they will look into all the situation. And when they see the situation of the generators, the new capacity addition becomes difficult. Not only that, the issues related to opening up of newer power plants deter investments. For example, there are a lot of issues related to land acquisition. A lot of power plants which were licensed by the central government could not actually start even the construction of the unit because of issues and challenges related to land acquisition. Then thermal power plants, especially based on coal, face increasing scrutiny of environment impact assessment, which mainly deals with the emissions control as well as the regulations enforcing the handling of ash. Of course, this is not to suggest that these are unwanted regulations. These are wanted, but these, combined with the earlier challenges with the generation units, the capacity addition has become more and more difficult in the recent past. So this was the issue dealing with the generation sector. Once the electricity is produced, as we have seen, it is transmitted using the transmission lines or the grids. And so there are some issues in the transmission sector as well, and let us understand those. We understand that whatever growth in generation, if that is not supported by the concomitant increase or enhancement in the transmission sector or the grid network, that generation of the electricity would be waste for us, because if it cannot be taken from point A to point B, it is of no use. And so India's transmission sector has also grown significantly in the past decades. Now, as far as the transmission sector is concerned, One of the issues can be said to be a cumulative effect of the issues in the generation. When the generation faces problem, transmission of course faces that impact. So that is one. But there are other issues plaguing transmission sector particularly, and one of them is location mismatch. You should understand that with increasing production of power, the sources of power and their locations have also become more and more complex. And if these red dots are power producers or the thermal power plants, then transmission sector needs to connect them with the main grid. And it has become challenge in the recent past because of the increasing land costs and other problems related to generation sector. The location of generation pockets are moving more and more away from the consumption sector. So now the thermal power plants are increasingly distant from the main cities, and so the transmission sector has to cope up with these challenges. Also, there are issues with the right of way. So as the name suggests, right of way is basically the right of an entity to make a way over a piece of land. So we have seen these power transmission lines, but we know that when these long wires go from one pole to another, they obviously hang over a piece of land, generally farms. And when it comes to setting up power transmission lines, right of way has emerged as one of the significant challenges in the way of transmission. Because we know that in India, rural areas are not sparsely populated, but rather they are very highly dense. And generally, passage of high power transmission line creates a kind of outrage in local population, because of which it becomes difficult to lay them. For setting up these poles, they are large and they need significant amount of area, and the land acquisition becomes a problem over here as well. So in total, this not only constrains the transmission sector but also deters the participation of the private sector in the transmission sector. After transmission comes the distribution, which is the third stage in the power sector. This last mile link is where the Discoms come in, about which the editorial publishes a lot of issues. So what distribution companies or Discoms do is that they purchase power from the generation companies through power purchase agreements and then supply it to their consumers. But we'll see how this might be the last stage in the power sector, but this is the issue which is creating the most problems, because of which the upstream of power supply faces problems, because it is here that most of the challenges are being faced. And so all the factors can be segregated into two parts: factors affecting revenue and factors affecting power purchase costs. Let us understand those factors which impact the revenue of the distribution companies. You see that ultimately distribution companies gives electricity and charges for it. The bills which we pay go to the distribution companies. Now here there are a lot of problems. First is that governments provide subsidy to the agriculture sector. Government wants to increase the productivity of the farms, and for that most of the states have made electricity free of cost for agricultural purposes. And so what the state governments do is that they announce these subsidies. They tell the Discoms that you provide the electricity free of cost to the farmers, and instead we will pay you the amount. But what happens actually is that the payment from the side of the government is quite irregular and often insufficient. But since most of the distribution companies are controlled by the state government themselves, they have no option but to incur losses. And this leads to cash flow issues, and the cash-strapped Discoms are unable to purchase power even if the demand exceeds and even if the surplus power is readily available, since they have incurred so much losses by providing subsidies that they do not have the capacity to purchase more power. So that is one issue. Next issue again deals with the subsidy, and that is called cross subsidies. Now subsidy, as we understood, is actually not charging a person for usage, but cross subsidy, just like in railways, is providing subsidy to one sector but charging extra from another sector for the same usage. Most of the states keep the tariffs of electricity very low as far as they are for the domestic consumption or the consumption at homes. And to compensate this particular loss, what they do is that they increase the tariffs of electricity usage by the industries or the commercial shops, and that is why there is a differential rate. Whenever in your locality you ask a commercial user, they will let you know that their charges are at least 1.5 times what you pay for per unit of electricity, and that is cross subsidy. Now, cross subsidies still can be justified for the political purposes, but the matter of the fact is that most of the electricity charges for rural areas are even waived off, and so even the cross subsidy is not implemented effectively. So even the minor charges which could have given a boost to the revenues are not even demanded from the domestic sector. And of course, we have aggregate T&C losses, or aggregate technical and commercial losses. And the concept of this T&C losses provides a realistic picture of the loss situation, which is a combination of energy loss, which is either technical loss or the natural loss or theft or inefficiency in billing. For example, many users in the smaller towns do not even have the meters, but they still are using electricity, or even if they have meters, they are not paying the bills. And so these are the T&C losses, and they play a big role. About 1/3 of the all losses of the Discoms are due to the T&C losses. So these were the factors affecting the revenue of the Discoms, but there are challenges due to the power purchase cost as well. And one of the most important of them is increasing cost of power purchase. So power purchase, which accounts for around 60 to 70% of the total cost of Discoms, have risen sharply. As we have understood, there are issues related to power generation because unavailability of coal or imported coal, or issues due to land acquisition, all these have increased the cost of the power per unit, and so the increasing power purchase costs has become one of the problems. But the issue is that generally distribution companies cannot pass on the increasing cost per unit of electricity to the final consumer, and so if they are paying the higher cost to purchase the electricity but they cannot charge that increased price from the consumers, that adds to the losses which they have already piled up. And then we have issues related to renewable power purchase agreements. The government has made efforts to promote renewable energy, we understand that, and in order to promote renewable energy, they have mandated the distribution companies to secure a certain percentage of power from renewable sources. We all know that. But we also know that renewable energy more often than not is more expensive. If we include the overall cost of generation, transmission and everything, it comes out to be higher per unit than the electricity produced by the thermal, except for the solar, of course. And also, as soon as it is produced, it has to be consumed, and so it also creates uncertainty as regards the source of the energy, and so it has created a lot of confusion as well, because of which the distribution companies are perpetually in loss. And it's not like the governments are not paying attention to these problems. And especially with respect to the distribution sector, the two important schemes of the government of India are UDAY scheme and IPDS, or Integrated Power Development Scheme. Now UDAY or Ujjwal Discom Assurance Yojana was launched in 2015 because at that time as well the losses were massive, the debts were very high, and the distribution companies were just reeling under the pressure of NPAs, and it was also creating a problem for the banking sector. And so this particular scheme was designed to turn around the financial position of state power distribution companies. And hence, the scheme provided for the takeover of 75% of the debt of Discoms and issuance of lower interest bonds to service the rest of the debt. So the central government allowed the state governments to take over 75% of the debts of the distribution companies, and for the rest 25%, it allowed issuance of low interest bonds. But in order to avail this scheme, the state had some obligations as well, and these were, they had to reduce their technical and commercial losses, that is T&C losses, and they had to revise their tariffs, they had to increase their tariffs, they had to make their tariffs such a way that it is reflective of the cost of the production as well as the transmission. And so if the states would do these two reforms, they would make themselves available for or eligible for UDAY scheme. So since 5 years, the progress in this regard has been mixed, not very positive, not very negative. And so that is why the government is thinking of coming up with UDAY 2.0. And the second scheme was Integrated Power Development Scheme, or IPDS, which provided for strengthening of sub-transmission and distribution network in urban areas in almost all the states. And then it provided for metering of distribution transformers, feeders, as well as consumers in all the urban areas, so that these T&C losses could be minimized. And these schemes have been put in place. It has been 5 years. The outcomes have been mixed. Now you have to find out why the outcomes of UDAY scheme as well as IPDS has not been as it was thought while they were launched. And so let us now just discuss the way forward. What should be and can be done now to extricate the power sector from the troubles? And so first, we will understand the way forward in case of generation sector. The government should pull out all stops to provide single window clearances for all approvers required to set up a power plant. Then central government should ensure the availability of quality fuel throughout year for decades. If that is not ensured, the investment in generation sector will be very minimal. And then of course, the development of the coal linkages, because we already have a lot of coal. The problem is the removal of the coal from the mines, and that should be ensured. And the government has already taken a lot of steps in this particular direction, but we'll see in times to come whether they are bearing fruit or not. Then as far as a transmission sector is concerned, we need significant investments to augment the capacity as well as to replace old and dilapidated networks. So right now the transmission lines, most of them are old, and so there are a lot of power losses while they are being transmitted itself. And so we need huge investments in our power grids. And then finally, as far as the distribution sector is concerned, we have to focus on reduction of technical and commercial losses. We have to adjust the tariffs in such a way that they reflect the cost of the production as well as the transmission. And now the government should actually implement the open access. Now, open access as a term means a mechanism of the government which allows large users of power, typically having more than 1 megawatt of energy uses, to buy cheaper power from the open market, which is not allowed to other users. So we cannot choose our distribution companies. But the government has allowed consumers who consume more than 1 megawatt of electricity to choose their suppliers. And the idea is that the customer should be able to choose among a large number of competing power companies. So it helps large consumers like textile industry, cement and steel plants and aluminum plants, all of them. It helps everyone. But the problem is that most of the states have chosen not to go with the open access policy, although they agree in principle to this particular mechanism. But when it comes to enforcement, they have not resorted and they have not allowed their own consumers to follow or practice open access. And hence, an important step would be to actually enforce the open access policy. So in this regard, we have understood the stages or the pillars of our power sector: generation, transmission, distribution. We understood the issues with all these three stages. We also went through two important schemes of the Ministry of Power in the central government, and then we looked at the way forward as to how we can resolve and extricate the power sector from the troubles. Let us now move on to the next news. The next article, the Gilgit-Baltistan game plan, appears on page number 7. And this particular article is regarding a lot of reports emerging out of Pakistan which indicate that Pakistan government is on the verge of declaring Gilgit-Baltistan a province of Pakistan, which essentially means that so far Gilgit-Baltistan has not been the province of Pakistan, although it is administered by Pakistan. And so it is important to understand how Gilgit-Baltistan has been administered after 1947 and why in 2020 Pakistan has suddenly decided to integrate Gilgit-Baltistan and declared it as a province. So before the independence, we all know that this particular region completely was being ruled by the Dogra rulers. Although their authority in this The region was very low, which we now call as Gilgit and Baltistan, but nonetheless, it was legitimately being ruled by Maharaja Hari Singh. But we know that in 19th and 20th century, there was something which is known as Great Game, which was a political and diplomatic confrontation between United Kingdom and the Russian Empire, especially the focus was Afghanistan, and for that, in order to be able to counter the increasing influence of Russian Empire in Afghanistan as well as in southern Central Asia, it was very important for the Britishers to have command over this particular region of Gilgit and Baltistan, and that is why, because of its strategic importance in the context of Great Game in Central Asia, this Gilgit region had been leased to the British by Maharaja, and hence it was under the control and the direct control of British government until 1947. So this particular region was already leased out to the British so that they can set up their military base camp in order to be able to counter the increasing influence of Russians. And so we can say that it was controlled by Dogra, but for the Great Game, it was leased to the British. But after the independence, we know that Jammu and Kashmir initially remained an independent state. But later, in October 1947, tribal militia backed by Pakistani army crossed the border into Jammu and Kashmir. They attacked the Kashmir and they took control over significant territory of the Jammu and Kashmir state. Although later on, this matter went into United Nations and later on a resolution was passed calling for Pakistan to withdraw from all of the Jammu and Kashmir and for India to reduce its forces to the minimum level and to conduct the plebiscite. That is a matter of another discussion. But during the same time when the rebels were attacking the Kashmir Valley, the British commander of Gilgit region revolted against the orders of Maharaja, and sensing the local population's support for joining Pakistan, handed over its administration to the Pakistani government. But at that point of time, Pakistan declined to merge this particular region into itself because it knew the repercussions would be adverse for itself. Because this particular territory was linked to Jammu and Kashmir, and had Pakistan merged Gilgit and Baltistan region to itself at that time, it would have lost the case of Kashmir because Pakistan had agreed to decide this particular cause on plebiscite, and that is why it has continued to be governed although by Pakistan but in a form of administrative territory but not as a province of Pakistan. So now if we try to analyze the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir and the current union territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, we see that this particular region is of course union territory of Jammu and Kashmir controlled by India, whereas this is now union territory of Ladakh. This particular piece of land towards the northern side is Gilgit and Baltistan, whereas the portion shaded in black color is Pakistan occupied Kashmir or POK. The portion in yellow color is the area which has been ceded to China by Pakistan, which is known as Saksham Valley. And finally, this is Aksai Chin region. So that is how complicated the geography of Jammu and Kashmir is. So again, to re-emphasize the same point, this yellow region is the Saksham Valley north of Siachen Glacier, which is controlled by China. Aksai Chin again controlled by China, Ladakh and Jammu Kashmir Indian part, Pakistan occupied Kashmir controlled by Pakistan, and again Gilgit-Baltistan. And so far it has been governed and controlled by Pakistan as a separate entity. The question is why, which we have already answered, because of Pakistan's emphasis on the conduct of plebiscite. And if Pakistan had gone with the annexation of Gilgit-Baltistan into Pakistan as a province, then it would have been very easy for our country to make our own cause. And hence the question arises, why now? What purpose will be served for Pakistan by doing it now? And there are several reasons why Islamabad has now decided to formally integrate Gilgit-Baltistan into Pakistan. And the first and obvious reason is of course because India has revoked Article 370. And with the revocation of Article 370, India has officially made its point clear, and it has formally inducted Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh as a proper full territory of India. And so the Kashmir issue is in essence dead. And so for the Pakistan to even think of talking about plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir would be a very laughable proposition. And so by inducting Gilgit-Baltistan as a province, the Pakistan can get back at India, and it's like a revenge action. And the second important reason is that we have already understood that local population since the beginning has been in favor of directly integrating with Pakistan rather than integrating with Pakistan occupied Kashmir, because the population of Gilgit and Baltistan is majorly Shia, and they fear that their integration into Pakistan occupied Kashmir would create troubles as POK is in majority Sunni. And so by directly inducting Gilgit and Baltistan as a province would secure the rights of Shia people in this particular region. Then of course a Chinese factor can never be discounted, especially when we are talking about Pakistan. Various commentators on foreign politics and geostrategy suggest is that China is the main factor behind this recent step of Pakistan. First and foremost is that there are high level of Chinese investment in this region. If you see, CPEC passes through Gilgit and Baltistan, and so there are high investments from the Chinese side in this region. And in view of India's continuing claim to the area, Beijing is interested in delinking Gilgit and Baltistan formally from Kashmir. And as soon as Pakistan inducts Gilgit and Baltistan as a province, the Kashmir matter and hence the claim of India will also be dead. And so the investments of the Chinese cannot be embroiled into a kind of trouble. And the second important reason deals with the geostrategy. If you look at the map of China, this all is Chinese territory of Xinjiang. This is a Saksham Valley which is already in possession of China. This is Aksai Chin which is again China. And so Beijing possibly presumes that Pakistan will agree to a Chinese military presence in Gilgit and Baltistan. If that happens before Gilgit-Baltistan becomes a province of Pakistan or a formal state of Pakistan, it would be legally problematic, although practically still military of China can be placed there. But once it becomes a province of Pakistan, then of course it will be a matter of time before the Chinese military arrives in this part of the region as well. And hence, India is likely to face two front plus kind of scenario. Two front means China and Pakistan attacking at the same time from two sides. But now we have Chinese presence, or we might have Chinese presence here as well, which will be more troublesome. And so India must calibrate its response very, very carefully. Let us now move on to the next article. Let us now take up this article which appears on page number 7, India's outreach to Myanmar. Now we all know that from the perspective of international relations in GS2, the relation or the bilateral relation of India with its neighbors are very, very important. And Myanmar being one of the very important neighbors, although not very significant and active player in India's foreign policy, but nonetheless is important. It's important because of two reasons, or it's important mainly because of two reasons. First is that Myanmar, which in the map is located towards the eastern side of India's northeast, is the link to the ASEAN countries. ASEAN, which is the future of the global economy. We want to connect to ASEAN, and for that, for the land connectivity, Myanmar is the only option for us. We know that Myanmar itself is a member of ASEAN. It's an ASEAN nation. Is also a member of BIMSTEC, and so you can say that Myanmar is the common link between the South Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries. The second important reason why Myanmar is so significant is because of our northeast. We know that through land borders we connect to the northeast via Chicken's Neck. It's not only very narrow, but it is also very vulnerable because of the Chinese threats. And so we always want to create multiple ways to reach to our northeast. And one of the ways is of course Bangladesh, and another way is through Myanmar. Reaching Myanmar through Bay of Bengal and then taking the land or the river route into our northeast. Not only that, people settled along the borders of India and Myanmar share common cultural links. And so, if we can somehow connect both sides of the people through economy, it will lead to a multiplier effect in the northeast. And so that is why Myanmar is very, very important. So the recent visit of Foreign Secretary and Chief of Army Staff to Myanmar reflects India's commitment to this particular country. And so it is important for us to discuss what policy has India adopted towards Myanmar in the recent past. And so India's policy towards Myanmar is first and foremost characterized by non-interference in Myanmar's internal matters. Myanmar has been making news since last 20 to 30 years because of the dictatorship of the army there. Although India has supported democratization of Myanmar since 1990s, but India always wants that change to come from inside, driven from within the country. Now this has allowed Delhi to engage with the military of Myanmar as well as whichever party backed by the military is in power there. And so this particular visit would be viewed as India's support for Myanmar's efforts in strengthening the democratization. The second important aspect of India's policy towards Myanmar is that India wants engagement to supersede the criticism. India, of course, realizes the problems which Myanmar has created. For example, for India as well, the Rohingya crisis, which has led to the deluge of refugees inside India as well as in Bangladesh. But instead of criticism, India relies more on engagement with Myanmar to somehow resolve this problem so that the repatriation of these Rohingya refugees can be carried on. But other countries have resorted to criticism, but India has chosen engagement. Now we are aware of the increasing influence of China in the Indian subcontinent, and of course Myanmar is no exception, and not many countries have set up their embassies and offices in Myanmar, but China was the first one. And so, Myanmar's growing closeness with China and the recent proposal of China-Myanmar economic corridor is a cause of concern for India. And so, India wants to counter the increasing Chinese influence in Myanmar through increasing engagement. And so, one of the pillars of or the motivations behind India's policy towards Myanmar is to counter the increasing Chinese influence. Of course, there are some problems with respect to the implementations of the projects on ground on which we are outpaced by China always, but India has tried to manage that. Then India has based its engagement with Myanmar on strategic infrastructural development, be it the proposal to build a petroleum refinery in Myanmar that would involve an investment of around $6 billion, or the commitment to operationalize crucial Sitwe port in Myanmar's Rakhine state, or be it India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway as well as Kaladan multimodal transport project. So all these are India's commitment towards infrastructural development in Myanmar. Of course, some of them are for the India's own benefit. For example, the Kaladan multimodal project, which will be a connectivity project which will involve, of course, Sitwe port development and then utilization of Kaladan river going up to Paletwa, and then finally taking the highway to the Mizoram border. So that way we are trying to reach Mizoram by taking help of Myanmar, and of course Myanmar is supporting us in that. And then the issue of border management confronts both these nations. There are insurgent movements going on which are troublemakers for both India as well as Myanmar, and hence there is a lot of scope in border security and development cooperation. So when we talk about India and Myanmar, it is important for us to keep in mind the importance of Myanmar as far as India's views are concerned and what policy India has adopted for Myanmar. Let us now move on to the next news. This next article which we have chosen provides quite a new perspective on the center-state or the federal relations. Although not very important from the perspective of either prelims or mains examination, it is important for us to keep in mind that the federal structure of any federal state or a federal polity is not always consistent. So every federal polity has a constitution which carves out a sphere for the central government. At the same time, it carves out an area of autonomy for the regional units or the states. Some federal structures also have concurrent areas where both the center as well as the state have the jurisdiction, or they can frame laws or they can execute them. For example, India. Now, according to the author, whatever constitution may have to offer, the functioning of this kind of federal structure is dependent on the nature of party system. The one party dominant leads to the concentration of the power in favor of the center, and the coalition governments or the governments consisting of a lot of regional parties shifts the center of power towards the states, where the states are empowered and they can function more autonomously. And the author makes its claim with the help of the GST example. Now we know that earlier, that is in pre-GST era, states had the power to levy indirect taxes. They had the power to increase or decrease them as well. But through this constitutional amendment, the states gave up all their powers to unilaterally levy, collect, increase or decrease the taxes, and hence they shrunk their own authority. So in the federal structure, we can say that the implementation of GST has shifted the powers towards the center. Now, if you take the recent example of COVID, due to COVID, the tax collections have declined and so the revenues. The center earlier had promised the states to compensate for all the losses arising due to the implementation of the GST, and we have discussed it a lot in our DNS sessions that how the center has went back on it. Center has went back on the promise it had done, and also it has went against the constitution, because it was decided that all matters dealing with the GST shall be conducted or done through the mechanism of GST Council, which has the representation of both states as well as the center. But the mechanism which the central government adopted, that is the offer of loan and the putting up of conditions for availing the loans, was decided beyond GST Council, because the central government thought that at the council's meeting all the states will come together to force the center. But nonetheless, the center had its way. And so you can say that again the power seems to be shifting towards the center. And according to the author, this is nothing new, and in fact it is a manifestation of the party system in the country. When a single party dominates, the power remains to the center, and as soon as the influence of the regional parties or the state parties increases, the overall system becomes more federal rather than centralized. And for that, the author quotes the example of Congress dominance. If you remember, we have already discussed Congress system in our earlier DNS. Congress dominance was an era where not only at the center but even at the state level, most of these governments were of Congress party. And in that time, leave alone the autonomy of the state in other matters, even the budgets of respective states were being finalized by the Planning Commission, which is now dysfunctional. So you can understand that during the Congress dominance, such was the level of centralization. And if some of the states had the opposition party elected to rule, various mechanisms were adopted by the Congress at the center to keep the control over the state being ruled by the opposition party, either through the application of Article 356 or through the Office of Governor or through discretionary central grants and their variations. The states were kept in check. But as soon as the era of Congress dominance declined, came the era of coalition governments. We can see that before 2014, in last 20 years, all the governments were coalition-led governments. They consisted of a lot of parties. Many of them were important players at state levels. They were controlling the state governments. And so this particular relationship was based on mutual interest. The center would help states, would respect the rights of the states, and in turn, they would get the support at the central level. During this era, the states were not only empowered, but they were also confident. But with the arrival of NDA government in 2014 and increasing influence of BJP in overall national level, again we have come to the single party dominance, and that is why again the federal structure of our country seems to be tilted more towards central side. And so according to the author, this of course is not good for the federal structure of our country, but the overall functioning of the federal structure depends on the nature of the party system prevailing in the country. Let's now move on to the next article. Now outsiders can buy land in Jammu and Kashmir appears on front page. So Ministry of Home Affairs has notified new land rules governing municipal areas in Jammu and Kashmir, allowing any Indian citizen to purchase non-agricultural land in Union Territory. This has ended the exclusive rights enjoyed earlier by permanent residents of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir under Article 35A of Indian Constitution, which obviously has now been scrapped. We shall first understand the Article 35A's provision which enabled such kind of rule, and then what has been changed in the notification of the Ministry of Home Affairs. So earlier, Article 35A allowed only permanent residents to buy property in Jammu and Kashmir. We know that Article 35A was added to the Indian Constitution through Constitution Application to Jammu and Kashmir Order 1954. So it was not added through constitutional amendment. And it is important for us to keep in mind that Article 35A was like a saving clause, which is generally considered as an exception in law, which basically ensured that if state of Jammu and Kashmir makes laws on some or the other matters, which were of course mentioned in Article 35A, then such laws shall not be void on the ground that they violate fundamental rights or the part 3 of the Constitution. So let us now quickly go over to the provision of Article 35A. It kept out of the purview of the fundamental rights any law which defined the classes of persons who were permanent residents of state of Jammu and Kashmir. So any law which defined the permanent residency for Jammu and Kashmir, the provision of fundamental rights would not be applicable on that particular law. And then secondly, it said, a law conferring on such permanent residents any special rights and privileges like employment under the state government, acquisition of immovable property in the state, settlement in the state, or right to scholarships and such other forms of aid as the state government may provide. So all these matters were kept out of the purview of Part 3, and that is why acquisition of immovable property in the state was not possible for anyone except for the permanent residents, because it was kept out of the purview of Part 3 of our Constitution. Now, we obviously know that Article 35A has been abolished, and so Ministry of Home Affairs have already amended all the earlier or the previous acts which were made by the state government. And so let us now see what has happened now, or what is the current condition. So now the exclusive rights of permanent residents over purchasing or the owning of land in Jammu and Kashmir has been ended. And so it has opened up urban or non-agricultural land for purchase by outsiders, including investors. It has provided for setting up of an industrial development corporation as well. Also now, the government on written request of an officer, army officer, not below the rank of corps commander, can declare an area as a strategic area. And so, henceforth that area shall be used for operational and training requirement of the armed forces. Also, MHA has further amended the domicile law by allowing spouse of a domicile to be deemed a domicile. Earlier, this was applied only to the children of central government officials posted in Jammu and Kashmir for a period of total 10 years. Utilizing this provision, Jammu and Kashmir Industrial Development Corporation has been set up. And if it is unable to acquire land, the government could invoke the provision of Right to Fair Compensation Act and can acquire the land on behalf of the corporation. Now the provisions of the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act, or RERA, has now been extended to Jammu and Kashmir. The new construction projects in housing sector have now come under regulation in state of Jammu and Kashmir.